So before we get started, I kind of want to walk through what I have in mind for today so that we can plan accordingly. Now, obviously, if things change, we get through things a little faster, we can go from there. But today, it's really important that you are following along because we are going to be talking about Supabase. And this is not just like I can't say it without laughing, but you are going to have to sign up for an account. And it's going to be really important that you're following these steps. I'm going to be making an account as well so that you can follow along. But it's one of those situations where it's going to be a lot easier to get help now rather than trying to get it asynchronously and then you're falling behind. So please, 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 please make sure you are following along today. My thought is we should probably be able to make it to the demo for the cookbook and then we can take a break. I know it says break here, but just the way I'm imagining it, I think we'll probably be able to get here, take a break, and then go through the features. Again, we'll kind of play it by ear, but I just wanted to at least outline what I have in mind today. So we are going to be talking about databases and how to create and read data. So we've already been talking about API calls. We've been talking about CRUD operations. So let's start with the CRUD today with our database, right? So for today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the create and read operations in Supabase. You will learn how to insert new data into the databases. Oops, and also being able to query databases to get specific information. So by the end of this lesson, we should be able to use commands to add new records, retrieve data from the database, and then understanding structure and design of relational databases. So trivia question, right? Let's get our brains working. So look, if we had a table called students with the following IDs, being ID, name, age, and grade, which of the following would be the correct SQL query to retrieve the names of all of the students who are 18 years old? A, B, C, or D? Okay, we have some people dropping some A's in the chat. Is that our final answer? What are we thinking? We'll wait for one more. Great. Yep, it's going to be A. And the reason we know that is because we're looking for the equal sign, right? Now, if we were looking for older than 18, we'd want greater than 18. If we want 17, obviously equal 17, or younger than 18, we would have less than. And of course, we can always do less than, equal to, greater than, equal to, right? There's multiple options we can take. And then what if we have a table called employees with ID, name, department, and salary columns? So what would we need to add someone named Alice into the HR department with a salary of $50,000? A, B, C, or D? Okay, we have a B, we have a C, and GB, I know yours was for prior, I know. GB saying B, so we have BCCB, okay, and it's going to be C. And the thing that we can tell here, they almost look identical, but it's going to be insert into, okay? So the into is where that is going to make the difference. There's kind of a trick question, but just remembering the specific syntax we want, right? Now, add into, well, add isn't a phrase we can use, and then add here again, same thing. So it's kind of like both of them are close, but not quite, right? So again, it's insert into, and the rest of it is correct. We have the values. So just remembering, we would say insert into the table we want to add the data to. We're going to specify the columns we're updating. And then our values syntax is saying, hey, what follows is going to be the values we want to add into the table. Okay? So, databases. Typically, and I feel like you always have to specify that, right? Is there's not always going to be a consistency from application to application. But typically what you're going to see is what you'd say called the front end the backend, and the database. Now, the way it's labeled here is correct. The front end would be like your web application, let's say React. And then your backend would consist of your server and your database. So typically you would hear front end and back end, right? And then if you work on both, you might be called full stack. Point is, you have a front end and back end. Now, the database and the server are typically related in the back end, but they're two separate parts, right? And that's where we're going to get into here, where it depends on where you are. These words can be used a little bit flippantly, I think, at times. So that's where you're going to see here. It's listed into three key phrases: front and back end database. But 9 times out of 10, the database and the server, or your API, are typically just grouped together in the back end. Okay. So this is where we're thinking about an e-commerce application as an example. So your front end, right, would be like product listing search functionality. So if I went to, I'm trying to remember, let's see, right, merch, I think is the name. Yeah, so let's see here, artists. Okay, so what we're seeing here would be the front end portion of the application, right? Where we're seeing all these different bands that you could purchase merch from. Let's see, the one I just bought some here recently. So it'd be Entheosis right here, right? So if maybe it'll do this for me, that'd be awesome. Okay, so let's see if I can see anything in the API call. Probably not. That's all right. Sometimes you can see the data that's coming through, right, for how it's being populated in here. So again, the front end would be, you have this image, you can do some search functionality, right? And you're seeing, again, the way that these cards or each item is populated. But to get that data, it's coming from an API, right? So we see here that backend, the server, the API, is used for user authentication and authorization. It's going to manage product inventory, right? If I was to go through and purchase an item, there would have to be a request from the front end to the API to authenticate that my credit card is valid. There's funds on there, right? There's all these different things that are happening that you can't do with the front end application. And then lastly, you're going to have the database, right? So that's where all of this information about the different merch to say, okay, which band it is, what the merch is called, how much it is. You could go in here and it would keep track of what sizes are available, how many of each item, right? And I think this one here, it's made to order, so there probably won't be an inventory issue. But all of that would be stored in the database. So the front end would make the request, it would go to the API, it would query the database to get that information, it would return it back to the API, and then that would be rendered on the front end, similar to how, if you remember, like the Bob's Burgers, right? So the Bob's Burger would make an API request with a character ID, it would go to the API. What we didn't see is it's querying a database to get whatever user information based on that ID. It collects that data, gets it back to the API. The API then sends it to the front end application, and then it renders all of that data accordingly. Okay. So that's typically what a application would look like. So, all these components are working together. But you're often going to see what's called BAAS, or you might hear BAS, right? Which can kind of help with this process. So what this means is it's backend as a service, okay? So what this allows you to do is have a single service. And what I mean by service is like, you think of how Google or Gmail is an email service, right? So I'm talking about a service in that approach. It's a service that has everything you need for user authentication, database management, file storage, all of that in a single service. So you don't have to have a separate API and a separate database to do everything. So In the class, you can drop it in the chat. Who here has heard of like a Firebase and Firestore? Have you heard of either of those before? It's Google products. Omar, yep. So those would be different backend services, right? They serve different purposes, but by utilizing those, you wouldn't have to have a you wouldn't necessarily have to have your own API. You could utilize Firebase and Firestore to bypass a lot of that, which is really handy when you're just trying to build a front-end application for like a hackathon, right? I don't know if any of you are familiar with hackathons, but you typically only have 24 hours to get a product up and running. It's a lot easier to utilize a backend as a service to get that going instead of spinning up your own API, which could take hours and hours to get that going. So to that point, with a BAS, right, this allows developers to focus on the front end and actual application logic without having to worry about backend service databases, authentication, stuff like that. Right? It's not meant to be a one size fits all situation, but who here is familiar with the concept of MVP, minimally viable product? Uh, Again, that's something where when you're trying to pitch an idea to a potential investor, to save on money, you're probably not, again, wanting to build an entire backend application, right? You just want to have something that can quickly demonstrate what your product is capable of. And if you could spend 2 hours with a BAS to get everything you need for user authentication, product management, etc., and have a working product, right? So you spend 2 hours getting that set up compared to potentially 24, 60, 100 hours. I mean, backend can take a lot of time depending on the scale you want, right? So you're looking at that from a return on investment, and it can save a lot of time to do that. But once you've moved past that MVP process, let's say you have an investor, you have some backers, well, now you need something a little bit more robust. So then you just build your own API and you're not having to have any major downtime, right? Because your application's already built out. So it really depends. And in this point in your journey, these services are going to be super helpful because you still get some familiarity with how a backend works, but you're not having to build an API and then manage a database on your own, which can be very intimidating. So any questions before we move on to what it actually kind of looks like tangibly? Does the concept of backend as a service make sense? Anything you'd like clarified at all before we move on? Not seeing anything in the chat, so we are going to proceed. All right, so let's look at some advantages. We've already kind of talked about this, but I think having more concrete understanding is going to help here. And so rapid development, again, this is going to reduce time to market for an application. So you think about, hey, I have a really good idea and I want to get it out there. The less time you have to spend working on it, the better, right? It doesn't mean you're trying to cut corners, but if you've ever sat through like a business presentation, you're typically going to see a lot of data, numbers, stuff like that. But 9 times out of 10, you're not necessarily going to see the final product in a sales pitch, right? You're just seeing ideas, you're seeing a mock-up, you're seeing demos, right? And that's the point is they want to sell you on an idea. So if you can demonstrate a working idea, but it's not final, that's typically enough for investors, right? To say, okay, they have an idea and they've actually materialized it. They understand it's not final, right? But that's enough to get the wheels turning in an investor's head. And not only that, but maybe you actually want to get the product out there and you're not looking for investors, but you're trying to apply for jobs. And you're like, do I hire someone to build a backend for me? Do I take the time to learn this backend language? I would say no. right? If you are a solid front-end developer and you just need to be able to have some back-end integration, while you are trying to find a job, a backend as a service or a BaaS is incredibly helpful because you're not having to spend the hours and hours and hours learning a new language just to get this front-end application you've already built working, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't learn those things. You absolutely should, but time is of the essence, right? And when you are applying and it's vital that you have projects to showcase, it's better that you spend more time developing your front end skills and producing these projects rather than spending the same amount of time to learn that back end language than you could have built 2 or 3 projects, right? So it's not just for companies, it's also for you as a developer. Cost efficiency. A lot of these backend as a services, they typically are pretty cheap if you're doing a small scale project, if not sometimes free. Now, there's obviously going to be catches to that, but it can also help minimize your overall cost if you're only paying for what you use. Scalability, I mean, this isn't really something we've got into a lot because we haven't quite built anything that would need to scale. But a lot of these services have built-in scaling so that if you increase your business, it's just a matter of upgrading resources. And again, you're paying for what you actually use. And honestly, I think for our sake, a lot of these, like the security features are really good, right? Infrastructure management, I mean, database management sure is important, but you're probably not going to be doing a lot of that, right? You're just probably going to be building a table or two and then working on that. But if you have to focus on server provisioning, sure, it's helpful. We're just not going to be doing that. But the security features are really important, right? Is you could use Supabase, for example, to handle user authentication instead of having to make an API where not only are you querying a database to see that that user exists or doesn't exist, but it's going to help with encrypting a password, right? The last thing you want to do is store an unencrypted password or unencrypted payment information, if you even save payment information at all. You definitely can't have that unencrypted, right? And then also, having some real-time capabilities is nice because if you're having a higher load of users coming in at a time, you can kind of see what's going on, right? Where are they visiting? What kind of, it lets you chart what analytics, like what kind of user usage your application's having, which then gives you a better idea of whether you should scale. Again, I think we had talked about this a while back, but there was like this social media website that overnight had an influx of users and they got hit with like a $90,000 bill because they weren't properly prepared for that. Right. So being able to have those resources in place goes a long way. And this wasn't with Supabase, mind you, but having those tools in place helps because you can have monitoring to say, hey, if there's more users coming in, upgrade uh, our resources, right? Rather than just having overage charges for that. So again, a lot of this is going to be above what we're doing now, but there are a lot of benefits to letting someone else handle this for you. So Supabase, again, this is what's going to allow us to have our back end a lot more manageable rather than having to take the time to learn a back end language. So Supabase is a BaaS, right? Designed to simplify app development. So we can create powerful and scalable applications without having detailed knowledge of backend infrastructure. What that's not saying is you don't have to know any of this, right? We're still going to have to incorporate what we've learned about API requests and SQL querying, but it's going to be a lot more manageable. So it's built off of Postgres, which we've talked about before, which is a version of the SQL querying language. And in that, we will be able to handle real-time data synchronization. It'll allow you to do user authentication, file storage. Now, we're not going to be worrying about authentication, right? It's good to know if you build any CRUD application, being able to demonstrate how to handle user authentication is vital. But for our sake, we're not going to be worrying about that. It's mostly just going to be the database functionality. So why Supabase, right? There's a handful of basses out there, sea bass, Chilean bass. Just kidding. Sorry, I had to. But there's several reasons why we're going with Supabase first. And first, it's because it's super easy to use. And like, I'm not joking. Like, it's very intuitive. It's not hard to navigate. It's very easy to make updates. It's just a very user-friendly process. And it's very simple to set up as well. Supabase also has a lot of client libraries and SDKs for proper or popular front-end frameworks. So you could use Supabase with React. You can use Supabase with Angular, Vue, I think even Svelte, there's a client library in there. So it's not hard to integrate into your project, whether that's a new project or an existing one. It's built on top of Postgres, which we've talked about, even though we haven't worked specifically with Postgres, those SQL queries we've been writing are going to translate really well over into Postgres. Point four here, it does have a very active community of developers, right? So whether that's internal or external, it's not hard to find solutions to your questions. I remember last cohort, a handful of people weren't sure what to do, but they were able to find the answers on their own. Now, obviously, you can reach out to Veronica if you need assistance, but it's very rare with Supabase, unless you just are doing something brand new, that you can't find good resources to get yourself unstuck. Okay. Nice thing is there's no vendor lock-in. It's an open source platform, right? So let's say you decide to go somewhere else, that's fine. They'll let you take your data. They're not going to force you to stay with them. And we talked about this before, but almost most importantly, they do have a free tier for small projects. Okay. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and preface this now. I can't remember if it mentions this in the lesson, but you will get emails for the account that you sign up to say, hey, you haven't made any requests to this database, you haven't accessed this database for a certain period of time. It's going to go to sleep. It is very important that you pay attention to those emails and reactivate your account. Speaking as a TA last cohort, I think almost all of my fellows, I had to be like, hey, I need you to reactivate your project so I can grade it. Because by the time I got to grading, it had already fallen asleep and they'd have to re-up it. Right. So you will get those emails. Please make sure you're reading those emails. Otherwise, Veronica is going to have to reach out to you and be like, hey, you need to reactivate your project so I can grade it. Okay. So I just want to at least get that out now. If you have any questions about that, let us know, but at least that way it has been verbalized. Okay. So we are going to be signing up for Supabase. So I need to make sure in the chat, I don't know how many people are present today, but please drop it in here in the chat to let me know that you are present so that we can get started on this. Okay. I don't want to leave anyone behind. We'll take our time, make sure we're all good. And if for some reason you're not able to today, just please make sure you do it like ASAP, right? The last thing we want to see is you get stuck because there's something here, but it's pretty straightforward. Okay, Joseph, Omar, Timo, Sarah. Okay, Juby, awesome. Okay, so supabase.com. Pretty straightforward, right? Nothing here has changed from the screen recording. So what we want to do is up here. We don't want to click sign in unless you already have an account. I do, but I'm going to make a new account. Okay. So what we want to do is click on this green button here that says start your project. Okay. So we have a couple different options here of how we can do this. You can either create an account with your GitHub, which is what I would recommend if you have a GitHub. So if I click on this, I don't think, since I already have one, let's see if it will. Cool. Yep. So if I didn't have that GitHub in there, I'm gonna try something a little different here. I'm gonna log out and I'm open an incognito window. Okay. So you'd click here on continue with GitHub, and it's gonna ask you to log in with that GitHub account. Okay. So I do have a separate GitHub account I can do this with. So let me find that. This one here. So you put your email in, your password, and then it's going to want you to authenticate. Give me 1 second. So over here, actually, not that I have anything to hide, but just if there's any client information. Okay, so verify your device. Okay. So we'll go back into here, put my code in. Okay, so what you should see is that this point is going to say authorize Supabase. So it wants to access my correlation one account. Okay, because that's where I made my Supabase through, or I guess that's what I called it, right? So this is really all it's going to need. So then I can say authorize Supabase. And then from here, it's going to handle the authentication. It's going to redirect me. And it should take me to the dashboard. Okay. So it should have something like this. Okay. Now, if you don't have GitHub, we could just make a new account, right? So let's do the hello present band at gmail.com. Let's make a new password. Change this later. Okay. So it should have something like this. Select all animals that appear alone in the image. Okay. Invalid login credentials. Oh, so sorry. Click sign up now. I was not paying attention to the wrong thing. I was paying attention to the wrong thing, rather. So we'll do that here. Let's do Supabase. Just made this. Okay. Hello, who's it, man? Okay, so you should see here all the check marks, right? Based on whether your password is satisfactory or not. And click sign up. Okay. All right, Joseph, you're sending something, but I cannot see what it is. Does anyone else see what that is saying? I cannot. Okay. So, okay, after the login website's asking to create an organization. Perfect. We'll take a look at that here in a second. So right now, you should see a screen once you've created your account. It says continue with GitHub or check your email to confirm. Okay. So of course, if you already signed up with your GitHub, you wouldn't see that. Again, that's where I'd recommend doing that, right? Is even if you use a different email, you can still link it up with your GitHub. But since I'm not doing that, I'm going to confirm my email. And it's going to take me to this tab here. Okay, so it looks like I need to log in now that I've authorized my email. Okay, and I have to do more authentication. Awesome. Okay, so like Omar mentioned, it says we're going to want to create an organization, right? So just say David's dev work. Okay. Type of organization, you just say personal, right? None of these other ones are important. And then your plan, you want $0 a month. Okay. And after that, that's all we need to do. So, oh yeah, we do need to create a database password, excuse me. I did not have that here in the steps. So at this point, we want to actually name our project, right? So let's talk about the project we're working on today. It's called My Cookbook. So we could call that here, right? My Cookbook. Database password. This is the password to your Postgres database, so it needs to be hard and or strong and hard to guess. You can generate a password here. Now you want to make sure to save that, right? So I'm going to copy this off to the side and save this. Please make sure you do that. Postgres. Region, if you honestly just select region closest to your users for the best performance. So this is where for your project, I would probably recommend doing West US. Veronica, are you still in West Coast?
No, I'm not.
Okay, okay. So which one would be helpful for you? West US, East US, or I guess I think it's all just one of those two.
I'm in Central right now.
Okay, so I would
A bit closer
say
to that, I
for
guess.
yeah, for the project, probably do East US, but for right now, you can do whichever one, right? It really doesn't matter at the moment. So I'm just gonna leave it as East US for myself and then hit create new project. And then here we go. Okay, so this is where we should be. Okay, so we see setting up project, it's provisioning a database and API endpoints. Okay, so it's going to take a few minutes. So who was not able to get to this point? Again, Joseph, I literally cannot see your screenshot, so I don't know what you're trying to send me. It just looks all blurred. But we're going to give it a few minutes. I do not want to go past here if someone is stuck and I am able to help them right now. Okay, Omar, you said, oh, the screen is, are you talking about what Joseph sent? Okay, yeah, it's, gotcha. That's so weird. I don't know why it's being that way for me, but this is literally what I'm seeing. Okay, give it a few more minutes, make sure everyone's good. Uh, Sarah, should we use a region? So again, for this assignment, sure. Um, the reason why you may want to specify is it's based on the user, right? So that's where it can get a little tricky when developers aren't necessarily in the same region as the users. So again, for this assignment, for what we're going to be doing today and tomorrow, go ahead and use your region, right? When we go to the project for this module, I would suggest using a US based region because it's largely going to be Veronica that is testing it. Now let's see here. So Supabase region. So project transfers are only transferring projects across an organization, cannot be used to transfer between different regions. To move your project to a different region, see migrating your project. So probably wouldn't be a huge deal if you left it in yours because we're not going to be doing a high amount of data queries, right? So it's not like you're going to have thousands of users. But again, just something to be mindful of, right? Is it's good to have your server located in the general proximity of where users are going to be, right? Okay. So I'm not seeing anything about being stuck. I want to make sure we're not moving too quickly. So is anyone stuck or can we proceed? Okay, Omar, Joseph, this is good. Email is cool. Awesome. All right. If you are stuck, please ping Veronica. She can help you get unstuck. Okay. But we are going to move forward. All right. Sorry, my landlord, I got a call about termite treatment. I was like, I'm making sure it's the right thing. And she forgot to tell me about it. So, okay. So once we've completed the sign up process for Supabase, we need to create our first project. So again, this is here in case you signed up and it doesn't automatically get you to that point. So let's say you didn't have an opportunity to do this, right? So we could go back to supabase.com and we could click new project. Now, to be clear, there are limits on how many projects you can have going for a free plan, okay? So when you click new project here, it'll ask you to choose the organization to build it under, okay? So David's Dev Work is the only organization I currently have. You would add your project name, you would want your database password and the region, right? Now, there are some security options. Don't worry about these, okay? Just make these selections, create your new project. So again, if you think about organization, maybe you are a freelance developer, but you have different clients, that would be where you might want different organizations, right? Just think about it where within a single application, you could have, for example, like an enterprise company, right? You have several applications even within a single product, right? So you may want different projects based on an organization, but it's still related somehow. So it's kind of up to you to decide how you want to do that. But ultimately, for right now, all you're going to want is your single organization and your single project. Okay. So project name, that's going to be the unique identifier for your project. It's not going to be all of your tables. That's not going to be like your table name, right? You can have multiple tables within that project. And I suggest calling it my cookbook. You can call it cookbook, right? But that's what we're going to be working on today. Okay. Database password. So you're going to need this to be able to manage and access the database. You don't want to have this accessible to anyone, right? So You can generate that password, but that's where I was saying, please make sure you save a copy of it somewhere because you will need it. Okay. And then region, again, this is where I was saying just kind of depends, but for this instance, just set it closest to where you are, right? But you're always going to want to set it to the region closest to your target audience. Okay. So again, for our example, select the region that's closest to your location for optimal performance. Now, API keys. We've talked about these before. We haven't really spent a lot of time in figuring out what they are and what they do. So these are what you'd consider a unique identifier, which allows an API to either allow or reject someone from accessing the API, right? So it's a form of authentication, which allows you to either successfully or unsuccessfully interact with an API and request data, uh, delete data, update, etc. So API keys, typically, I can't really think of any other instance where they wouldn't, but it's going to be provided by that service or platform that's offering the API, right? And it's going to be specific to your user. Now, I know there's a meme out there like, hey, Copilot's great because people are putting their API keys in the chat all the time. And, or I guess rather, when you use Copilot, it can go through GitHub and find the people who have committed their API keys in data storage. I mean, yes, that's not a good thing to do, but just be aware using someone else's API key can be a violation of contract, right? And not only get that person in trouble, but then blocks you from ever being able to use it. So just don't do that. Just because someone made a mistake doesn't mean you should be capitalizing off of that. Because what happens is when you make that request to an API, if you remember the request headers we talked about a few weeks ago, that API key is typically included in there so that when the request goes to the API, they see that API key, they validate it, so then they know that they can allow you to make the request that you need. Okay. So again, keep them secure. We haven't talked about committing and Git and all that stuff. But once we do, it is super, 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 super important to never have your API key public. Okay. So, and this is why there's several reasons. So security, right? It's a form of authentication. So if someone gets your API key, it could be used by someone to gain unauthorized access to a system, steal data, etc. Now, you think about like the Star Wars API, right? Like they have their safeguards in place where an API like that, you're only able to retrieve data, right? So I mean, what is someone going to do with the Star Wars API, right? That's not what this is talking about. It's talking about an API where maybe it is like internally, right? You work for a team and that data, or I guess the API you're trying to request has user social security information, has their date of birth, address, right? And maybe it's all encrypted, but if you have the data, someone's going to be able to figure out how to de-encrypt it, right? So that's the point is without that API key, a person could not make a request and be allowed into that API. They have that API key, they could find a way to brute force and get that information. So it's not great. Again, that's where this protection of data is really synced up with that, right? As soon as that system's breached, now everything has to like be reanalyzed, cleansed. It's a huge infosec nightmare, right? So it's not just okay, an API key gets leaked, but no one used it. It's okay. Well, now it's public, right? And now you have to re-examine every entry point to make sure, well, are there any other gaps? How long has it been public, etc. Financial implications, right? If you have an API key to a API where it costs per request, and someone decides to spam those requests with your API, well, guess who's going to be responsible for those charges? It's you, right? Not the person who abused it, because it's your fault for having it public. Now, if someone hacked you somehow and got your API key, that might be a little different, but if you're just leaving your API key in public, you're not going to be able to argue against that, right? That is your responsibility in keeping it safe. Reputation damage. So if you think about a bunch of these companies, like, I mean, we're using Slack, but Slack is notorious, unfortunately, for data breaches, right? So I don't think it's necessarily API keys, but just in general, like if you think out of a program or a software as a service that you've been utilizing and they're known for leaving their information out in public, like that's not a good reputation, right? And as a developer, it is your job to make sure your clients don't lose any trust in you as well. And compliance requirements, I mean, it could lead to legal penalties and fines if there are rules in your region, right? To say like it is your job to not have these in public places and you do. It's not just a matter of, oh, well, someone accidentally got access to our API, but you could also be sued. There could also be legal damages, right? So it's again, you think about like a Star Wars API, probably not such a big deal, right? But the goal isn't to only care about it when it is a big deal. The goal is to care about this in every instance so that when it is a big deal, you've already set those best practices into place. So you're not thinking twice about it, right? You know to keep this information secure. And that's where a .env file is one of the most secure methods for handling something like this. It's not foolproof, but it's definitely a lot better than leaving it in your code. Okay. So a .env file is short for an environment file, okay? And this is where we keep environment variables. So we're not doing this right now, but what you would do is create a file that's literally just .env, and you would save it in the root directory of your project. When you use Vite to create a React application, when we create a new variable name, what we're going to do is we're going to call it Vite underscore variable name. Okay. And then we're going to put equals in the value. And the reason for this is this Vite underscore, we're going to be able to access this variable in the different files that we need. Okay. But this .env, what this means is if you were to push your code to a repository, which we have talked about before. So if we were to push it to a repository, then it is not going to be what's considered committed or going to be saved in a public manner, okay? The reason for that is if I was to go to GitHub, for example, and I pull up one of my accounts, right? So I'll just pull up this project I've been working on for my brother-in-law, right? So all of these files that you see here have been what you'd consider committed. But what you're not going to see is my .env file, which has everything I need. It's still technically in there for what it needs to be, but for the sake of privacy and public, even though this is private, if I was to make this public, you would not be able to find that .env file. Okay. So my application will run as it needs to, right? So I could click through here, right? It loads up. I haven't logged in months, but the .env file is there. It's just not publicly visible, right? So I'm not worried about if I had an API key, I wouldn't be worried about it going anywhere. Okay. So again, that's where you would see Vite underscore whatever you want to call your variable. So like API key, you would set this as the value. And then inside of your file that you want to get the API key, we would create a variable like const API key equals, and then we'd say import.meta.env.variable name. And now this const API key variable has that value here, but you're not going to see it here. Okay. And when your component renders, it knows it's importing it from the .env file, so you're not going to see it there either. So very simply put, if you do this correctly, anything environment variable wise stored inside of this file It's not going to be exposed in the client side code, right? So what the client would see, and it would not be accessible to unauthorized users. So it's loaded into the application's environment during runtime, and that's it. Okay. But you have to do more than that. And we'll get into this when we get into our Git section because we're not actually doing this now. But there is a file called a git ignore that you'd have to add it to make sure that it's not going to be committed. And then there's also other things you're going to want to do too, right? Is make sure only certain people have access to your repository. If you have an API key, try to rotate or regenerate those as frequently as possible. I don't mean like every day, but like once a quarter or something like that. It's not a bad idea, right? And then adding encryption too. So we're not really going to get into like the commit side, but we are going to be creating an env file, and we are actually going to be like utilizing an API key. We just want to make sure you understand if you have an API key, it needs to go into the .env file. Okay. Any questions about that outside of you just need to do it to understand it? But any questions about the concept of the API key, why it's important to keep safe? One more second. Okay. All right. So for the example we're going to be working on, it's going to be a cookbook, right? And it's going to be a full-blown application. So what we're going to be able to do is create data, retrieve data, update data, and delete data from our database. Okay. Today, though, we're only focusing on creating and reading. So the CRUD of CRUD. Okay. And we've already added all the styling you need. So the focus here is not going to be how do I make this website look really nice. It's more of how can I just hook it up and get the core functionality working. Okay. So the project for the most part has already been set up, but we are still going to have to integrate the Supabase. Okay. So if we look over here, in a pages folder, we have home and create. Okay, so home is where we see the recipe cards. The create page is where it'll have a form to add new recipes to the database. Inside of our components folder, we have recipe card, which is each individual card for a recipe. We do have a Supabase client file inside of our config folder. Okay, so this is where we're going to connect to the database. But as you can see here, it's blank. And then our .env file as well. It is set up initially. Now you're going to see it says create our React app Supabase URL. I wasn't able to get that changed in time, so we're going to want to change that to Avit. Okay. So I will throw that in here if you just want to copy and paste that. We don't even need the app. Okay. And then our React router is also set up, right? So if you go to our index or main.jsx here, let's see, did they not? Oh, they put the browser router in here. Interesting. Okay. So I think someone had actually asked if you could wrap the browser router around the application. That's what it looks like they did here. I would argue it makes more sense to have it in the main.jsx. That's what I get for not opening that part beforehand, but really it doesn't matter. The reason why I wouldn't suggest doing this is let's say you have other components that you accidentally put outside of the browser router, then they wouldn't be in there, right? So it's up to you. I would just say best practice would be to take that out. And to be fair, it needs to be a single element. And then we can go into our main.jsx. And then browser router. And then we would have to make sure we're importing that as well. Which if I go back to here, yep, React Router DOM. Okay. So again, the app structure is already set up for us. We just need to be able to integrate Supabase into our existing project. Okay. So there's going to be three features. One is we're going to set up the database, create some tables, add some dummy data, and then make sure we have a connection with our React application. Feature two, we're going to retrieve that data from the database to render the content. Okay. And then feature three is we're going to be able to use that form that's already been created, and we're going to be able to add some recipes to the database. Okay. So here, and let me go in, edit the file, file tree, cookbook. I think I may still have, let me go into here. I'm going to log out really quick, everyone. I wanted to make sure we started from scratch together. So I'm going to continue with GitHub. After actually, what we'll do is this. It is on the hour right now. So, okay, one after right now. So let's do this. Let's do a 10-minute break. But let's be back at 12 after. So I'll give you an extra minute. So when we come back, we are going to start on feature one, where we're going to start getting all set up with our Supabase. And by that point, I do still have my existing project, right? So you see here, it has been paused over 90 days, so I can download as a backup and make a new project, right? So that's what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then by the time we get back, you should be able to see how the project works, and then go from there. Okay. All right. So if you didn't see in the chat, I was trying to work on exporting my data from the database and everything else, and it just isn't worth the headache at the moment. So I figured let's just do it together, right? That's the whole point anyway. So I'm going to share my screen again. Yeah. So you should be able to see here, we are on step one of feature one, connecting Supabase to React. Okay. So first thing we need to do is connect the database that we've created to our React application. So if for some reason you haven't made that project yet, you're going to need to do that. Okay. So we have to have some credentials to establish that connection. So what we're going to want to do is we want to be on this portion of our dashboard. Okay. So if you just load it up into Supabase and you go to the dashboard, we'd want to click on the project we're working on. Okay. All right. And then we want to see the project API section, which if you scroll down towards the end of the page, you're going to see that right here. Okay, so you're going to see a project URL and you're going to see an API key. Okay. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want those values. But let's talk about what these values are first. So the project URL is going to be the endpoint, right? So think about how we had API endpoints. This is going to be that endpoint that our application is going to use to communicate with that database. Okay, so this is going to be like our base URL. Now the API key, which we've just spent some time talking about, is that form of authentication. right? So yes, you can see my API key here, but I'm also trusting that you're not going to do anything with it, right? So I'm not worried about you. I'm not worried about the recording, but again, understand that's not something you should be sharing with people. Okay. So we need to add these to our .env file, and that's going to be pretty easy. So you can, if you want, copy this code here and paste it into here, but you're going to want to obviously replace this with what you have on your end, right? This isn't going to be correct information. So the URL and the API key in the example are not valid. Can't reiterate that enough. So go here, get our project URL. Oh, look, they have a copy button for us, right? Perfect. So I'll replace this here. And you'll notice that it is a string, but we don't have to put quotation marks around it, okay? And we want our API key. Copy that. There we go. Okay. So I had mentioned before, since we're using Vite, we need to make sure we have our beginning portion of the API key starting with Vite. After that, we can name it whatever we want, right? We could be DB URL, we could use Supabase key, whatever. But as always, it just needs to be something that makes sense, is straightforward, easily understandable. Okay, so we've copied the URL, we've copied the API key, and that's in our .env file right here. Okay, click next. So now we need to install Supabase, except it's already installed. So as a reminder, when we install a library or a dependency in our project, what part of the directory do we install it in? There's a specific word I'm thinking of, the something directory. Remember what that is? The root directory, Joseph. I knew you were going to say that. Awesome. Yep, that's exactly it. All right. So now that the URL and the API key are added to our environment file, we can start getting everything else set up. Okay. So with anything, always check the documentation, right? We're helping provide the steps for you, but imagine you were doing this on your own. What would you do? You'd want to check out the documentation. And we're referencing that even in this, right? We had to go and look at the documentation to figure out how to tell you what to do. So when we look here, since we are using JavaScript, right? I mean, yes, we're using React, but it's still technically JavaScript. We're going to want what's called the create client method, okay? And again, we're calling it a method, remember, because if it's a function that is in a class, it's a method, okay? So this is going to be our way to create a client, which then allows us to access the Supabase database, okay? The create client method is going to accept two arguments, the URL and the API key, okay? So let's go ahead and get this started. I know it can be annoying to type things out, but just bear with me. I promise it's good for your brain. So we're going to import create client from Supabase, and there's an at there in front of that, and then we want Supabase.js. So remember, we're able to do this because it's already been installed. I can look at my package.json file, and I can see that Supabase has already been installed. Okay, so I know when I'm doing this destructuring here, I know it exists. Okay. So now what we can do is we can get our API keys from the environment file. Okay, so I can say const supabase URL equals import.meta.env dot, and then I'm going to do vite underscore supabase underscore URL. And again, I'm doing this because that's what it's called here, right? So whatever this is, I need to have this be the same, okay? And just a reminder, we are working in React, right? But what we're making here isn't necessarily going to be a component. You can think of this as just being regular, even though it's a .jsx file, it really is just regular JavaScript. And you're going to find that in React applications, it's common to have files like this. It's what you'd consider like a configuration file, where you're not generating a component, you're doing some form of service configuration that would work here, Angular, Vue, right? Because it's just basic JavaScript. So since we're not doing any JSX, even though it's a JSX file, we don't need it to be, okay? It's just regular JavaScript. All right. And if you noticed, I have uppercase R there. I want to fix that. So now I'm going to say const supabase API key, which has a non-key, interesting. And then I'm going to do import meta.env.beat supabase underscore. Make sure, I'll copy this here. Better safe than sorry. Okay. So now this variable and this variable are using the values from our environment file. And now what I want to do is I want to create this client, right? So I'm going to utilize the create client method, which is going to populate a variable with my client. So I'll say const supabase equals create client, and I'm going to pass in the supabase URL and the supabase API key. Okay. Now I can say export default supabase. And by doing the export default, do we remember what this is allowing us to do? We've seen it with functions and components, right? So by saying export default supabase, what is this in essence doing? It's like Sarah's typing. I want to make sure, as we're doing these things that we really soaking in like why these syntaxes are important. Yes, so it can be accessible throughout the application. Absolutely. So we're exporting it, and now it's going to be a named instance, function, method, whatever it ends up being, right? So if I change this to supabase client, I would need to do the same thing here, right? Make sure the name is correct. But just for the sake of sticking with the example, I'm going to leave that there. Yeah, but that's exactly it. Now I can import this, and it's going to be this client that's been created with the URL and API key. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make sure this connection even works, right? So we're just going to do a little bit of troubleshooting here. So let's go to the home.jsx component, right? Which is up here, but if for some reason you close out, just remember source pages home, okay? And what they're suggesting we do is console log it, right? Probably not the way I would do it, but it'll work. So let's make sure we import supabase from, and this is where it's important to remember where we're at. How do we get to what we want to import, right? So we're inside of pages. So you'll see it's ... slash, right? So we're going from page. We want to go up a level to the config folder, config, and then supabase client is the name of the file. So we're going to import supabase from supabase client. And let's do, I'm going to do console.1. I'm going to do supabase. That just changes how it is presented in the console. Okay. So let's go to our terminal. Run npm run dev. Okay, so we see that it's running. I'm going to open this up here. I'm going to hit inspect console, and we can see that we have everything we're looking for, right? Here's my URL, here's my key, storage URL, storage key. So if you did everything correctly, you should be able to start the server, right? And when this is running, you should be able to open up the console and see that this object is fully populated. Who is here and not able to see this? Okay. So everyone is able to see the client. How about this? Can I get a thumbs up if you are able to see this in the console? So Timo, looks like you're able to see it. Because if we can't see this here, then everything else we're gonna do is gonna be broken. So I want to make sure we're not having any issues at this point. Oh no. Okay, I can actually see. Okay. So, all right. Import recipe card. So, Joseph, can you show me your home.jsx file? Because it looks like maybe you have recipe card twice. Is that the problem? Okay, you got it figured out. No, it's all good. Hey, that's literally, I appreciate you sharing that because that's what we're here to figure out, right? Not a problem at all. So let me know that you can get into your console and see that client populated. I haven't seen anyone else say that they're having issues. And once you give me that confirmation, we'll be good. Now, you're going to see this card here, right, with the garlic parmesan chicken bites. That's, if you go in here and you look at recipe card, right, it's already hard coded in there. So that's to be expected. And that's why prior, when I was trying to demo it out, it wasn't working because it was a quote unquote working project without the API key and everything in there. So that's where I was like, we're just going to start from scratch. Okay. So I'm not seeing any errors or anyone reporting any errors here. So again, if you are running into any issues, look at your errors in your console, right? But make sure, are my environment variables named correctly? Do my environment variables start with Vite, right? Or am I using the import.meta.env? These things are super important to make sure that everything's being populated correctly. So, all right. So I'm going to take that out because I don't need that. I know it works now. Okay. So we're going to hit next. And now that we know it's connected, we need to make a table. All right. So I am going to, let's see if this works. Can you all still see my screen fairly well? Is everything zoomed in well enough, or should I zoom in a little more? Okay, so let's make our first table. Okay, so table editor button. If it's a little bit smaller, it'll be this icon here, right? So now we can click on the button that says new table, or you can click down here and it says create a new table. All right. So let's follow this step here. or these steps here rather. So we're going to call it recipes. Okay. We don't need a description. That's fine. And then we do not want enable row level security enabled. Okay. So we're going to unclick that. Okay. Hit confirm. And the reason for that is just with it being in Codio, there's going to be some, it's just going to be easier, right, for us to not do that. But because you're saying right here, you're allowing anonymous access to your table. Okay. Otherwise, there's all these security headaches we'd have to run through with Codio, people grading the assignment, etc. So looking here, right, it really just going to boil down to, since it's not a public project, it's not a huge deal, right? But moving forward, if you were to make a public facing project, just keep that on. Okay. So again, just for ours, we're going to leave it off. The enable real-time option, we're going to leave that unchecked. That would just allow real-time updates, data synchronization, etc. We're not going to need that for right now. Okay. So now we want to go ahead and we're going to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows in our table. Okay. It is very important that all of these are not only going to look like this, but they need to be 100% the same. Okay. So stepping through row by row, we're going to have an ID. The type is going to be an int 8. There's no default value, and it is going to be a primary. The reason for this is how we are going to keep track of our recipes, right? Based on an ID. We don't want a default value. And since it's the primary, what that means is you are going to be able to update or delete based on this specific value or row, right? 9 times out of 10, that's what you're going to want to be your primary value is an ID. Now, since it's an int 8, it's just going to automatically increment, right? So we'll have an ID of 1, 2, 3. It's built into that. You don't even have to think about that, which is awesome. We are going to leave created at, and it should be a timestamp. Okay. And the default value should be now. If you remember from before, this now method means it's going to generate a timestamp based on when the record is created. It's going to handle that for us. It's awesome. Okay. All right, let me make sure. Okay, cool. So now we're going to do name. Okay. And we're going to set this as a text. Okay, it's technically a string, but we're going to set it as text. And we want our default value to be null, right? We don't want there to be anything in there before we create it. So now we're just going to create a prep time. Okay. This one's also going to be an int 8. If you click on search types, should be one of the top ones right there. Also going to be null. Okay. And then, sorry, let me turn this off. I'll do instructions, which will also be text. And then image URL, which will also be text. Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 columns. I said rows earlier, excuse me, 6 columns for each piece of data. Okay. So ID, created at, name, prep time, instructions, image URL. It is very important that we have all of these set up because as we go through the instructions, if there's any typos at all, your code is not going to work. Okay. Now we'll click save. Adding 6 columns to recipes. So now if I was to make this bigger, you'll see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. If I wanted to add another one, I could, but we're not going to. Okay. So let's go ahead and add some dummy data. And this is what we already have in our project, but we want to actually add it into our database now. So what we can do is up here, you'll see this green button that says insert. So let's insert a new row, right? We want a new data point for our table. So we're not going to do the ID, right? It's automatically generated. This is automatically generated as well, right? The date. So we can leave that. Now the name, let's copy it from here. Garlic Parmesan chicken bites. The prep time is going to be 30. We'll take these instructions and paste them in here. And then we'll take this image URL and paste it in here. Okay. So you'll see here the ID was generated as 1. We see it was created at 10:21 and it says 6:34. That's based on a shared time zone. And then we have a second recipe here that we're going to make as well. Okay. So let's do that again. Lemon soy glazed salmon. 20 minutes. That sounds very quick. Looks like there's an extra line in there. Take the image URL. And we now have 2 recipes in our table. Okay. Let me know when you've done that, right? Because we're going to want these as we move forward. We have a few people say they're done. All right. Is anyone not done and needs an extra minute or 2? Let's put it that way. Okay. So let's keep trucking. We're going to bypass this. So now we are on feature 2. Okay. So what we're going to want to do is, now that we have some recipes in our table, well, now we want to query our database to get that, right? So if you click through here on the documentation, and I'm going to move it over here to the side, it actually gives you some examples of what a fetch query might look like in your code. Now, this is obviously boilerplate code dealing with countries tables, right? That's not what we're doing. But it gives you an example where we see const, and now we're destructuring something from our query, right? So data and error. We're going to await Supabase. So as we talked about before, this is that client that we've created that we are now importing. And we're saying dot from. So we're saying, hey, we're going to query this table called countries. And then dot select, which is a method to select some data. Okay. So that underneath the hood is a SQL query. We're saying, hey, from this table, I want to select this data. It doesn't look like a SQL query we've been writing, right? But this is why these libraries are incredible, because you have to know what's happening, right? But we don't have to write all these SQL queries. They do it for us. So again, we are getting data and error from that response, right? Because we want to know if it fails. And then since we're looking to get all of the recipes, we're just going to have a basic select query. So const data and error equals await supabase dot from recipes, and then dot select. So we're going to fetch the entire list of recipes from that table of recipes. And then we are going to get all of them because we're not passing any arguments to limit or only get certain recipes. Okay. So we're going to use effect to get all of those, right? So if you remember prior to now, we would use the use effect to make that API request. Okay, I'm going to drag this over here, make this bigger. Okay, so let's go to our home file, right? So we already have recipe card and Supabase imported. So I'm going to do import use effect and use state from React. Okay. So this allows us to use effect and use state. Now we need to create some state, right? Just because we're getting certain things from the API, it doesn't mean that, or from Supabase, doesn't mean that that's all we have to do, right? So again, the benefit of having state is we may be setting the state, or we may be getting a response, right, in our use effect. But if we set the state, now we can use that state wherever we need it, right? So it's not just a matter of we have it in one place, we're good to go. Well, maybe we need to utilize that state outside of that current scope. Maybe we need to use it in a child component. Without utilizing state, we can't do that easily, if at all. Okay. So step 2, let's create some state, right? So we'll do const fetch error and set fetch error. And the fetch error here isn't saying, hey, we're going to get an error. This is saying, hey, there's an error with our fetch request. Okay. Use state, we're going to set the null. Then we'll do const recipes, set recipes equals use state, also null. Now, with our use effect, we're going to see here this, I wouldn't say big, but it's a bit, right? But this isn't new compared to what we've seen, right? We've already seen this whole process. So let's write this out and break it down. So we're going to do our use effect, right? And if we have an empty array here in our dependencies, remind me what that does again. Like, why would we want it to be empty? So again, in our use effect, we have an empty array here. Sometimes we may put something in there, sometimes we may not. So if we're leaving it empty, what are we attempting to do here? Timo says to clear it. Kinda. Yeah, what we're saying is we only want this to run when the component mounts, right? So it should only be ran once. Now, if you remember when we're in dev mode, it might run twice. That's just how the dev mode is set up. But if it's an empty array, it should only run when the component's rendered or it's mounted. Otherwise, if we have something in there, whether it's a state or a prop, it would run on initial load, and then it would also run again if either the state or the prop were updated. Okay. So let's create our method here. So we'll do const fetch recipes. Do our arrow function. We want to make sure it's an asynchronous method as well. So let's do our try catch. All right, so try catch. We want our error. So we'll say try, and then like we saw in the documentation, we'll do const data from error equals await Supabase, and we need the dot from. So we're going to put recipes in here because that's the name of the table, and then dot select. Okay. Oops. So we want to get everything from this table. Inside of here, what we're now going to say, so if error, so if we get something back from that error, we want to throw a new error. Okay, and remember, if we throw that error, if we're doing a try catch, that's where the catch is, right? Hey, I'm throwing you this error. I need you to catch it. So we'll do throw new error. Could not fetch recipes. Okay. And then since we're working on the error, let's just do that part right now. Okay, so we'll say set fetch error. We're doing error.message. And the reason for that is since we're throwing this error, we're making, technically it's a, if you highlight over here, the error is actually a constructor. I don't know if you remember talking about those. So when we make a new error, it's technically a class, and we're making an object where it has a message property and an options property. Okay, so by adding this string, we're creating this message property. So that's why we're saying error.message. Okay. And then we'll do set recipes to null, right? Because there's no recipes. So we need to set that to null. But let's go back up here. So if error, do this. But now we know if it moves past this point, there is no error, right? So we can do set recipes. We'll do data and set fetch error to null. Okay. So up to this point, we've done everything we need, but we also need to call this method, right? We can't not call that. So we'll say fetch recipes. But more than that, what do we need to do next, right? So we've set the data, whether it's successful or not. But once we've set that data, what is the next thing we need to do? We have our state of recipes, but what do we do with that state? How are we going to render this? I left it up here just to see if that might help, but we have to make sure to pass it down as a prop. Right, so first thing we want to do is before we even do that, we do need to make sure that we're rendering that error message. Right, so we'll go in here and we'll add this on line 33. We'll say fetch error, which means if fetch error is truthy, double and we're going to render that fetch error. Okay. Hopefully it's not, but we want to have our error handling just in case. But if there are any errors, right? So let's take this recipe grid. We're going to say curly brace recipes double and. We have to use parentheses to now render this, right? So we have our div with the class name of recipe grid. Inside of here, we're going to say recipes.map. We're going to have a single recipe, arrow, parentheses, and now we're going to do our recipe card here.